film sort of takes you on an arc from psychedelic experience and what's transformative about psychedelic experience to a case for meditation. The claim is not exactly that if you got rid of all the concepts, then you would be fine, because then enlightenment would just be you can't move or do anything or make sense of the world at all. And that's obviously not the condition that you want to end up in.
Right.
But that particular confusion does emerge from the way people first get introduced to these insights through psychedelics.
I knew you were a gifted editor because you basically dropped 3 of the best video essays I've ever seen.
You heard this Jung line, all religion is like a defense against an encounter with God.
Oh, wow.
It's a very interesting phrase, right? Because you think like the religious structure exists to give you an encounter with God. But actually he's like, the dogmatic structure, it's keeping those archetypal energies, you could say, present to consciousness and causing you to participate in them so as to protect you from that bare, unfiltered encounter with the mysterium tremendum that all of your cognition is organized around avoiding.
How do you view identity? Is that something to be just thrown to the wayside, or is it something you can actually leverage to act morally, act rationally, act towards whatever goals you may have, or should we throw it all out? Hi, Jake.
Are we in it?
We're in it.
All right, man.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you're dropping a movie.
I am at long last, after with great difficulty, but now it's coming.
Tell me the story behind that.
The film is a film about psychedelics and meditation and neuroscience and awakening and related topics, commissioned by the Waking Up app, the Sam Harris meditation app. And it has a little bit of like a long genesis. I had made these films about Eric Weinstein's ideas on YouTube, and somehow, I actually don't know the precise lineage, somehow those got in front of Sam, maybe through Eric. I also think I had done a podcast with Christopher Lovgren about meditation things that I think, this is how I've reconstructed the genealogy a little bit, but I think he was tagged in. And somehow, by the time it got to me through Sam's manager, Jaron, they were like, who are you, weird person in Sam's sort of politics and meditation world? And that precipitated a process whereby I was sort of started pitching them things. My neighbor at the time also turned out to work at the Waking Up app. So it was a really weird confluence of circumstances. But they were in a mood of sort of reaching out to different types of creatives to see if they could make content related to the mission of the app, and I pitched them on a film. And then many other things ensued to sort of actually get it through the door, but it's now finally in about 8 days going to get released. So
that's awesome.
Yeah,
I've seen it. It's honestly so good. So I knew you were a gifted editor because your video essays. You basically dropped 3 of the best video essays I've ever seen, and then just refused to elaborate and left. Like everyone's like, "Where's
what I'm told?" Yeah,
where's the 4th one? And you can tell very clearly that skill carries over into the film. But like, what was the inspiration behind wanting to cover the topics you covered in the film?
So certainly for the last decade or so, meditation has been a main interest of mine, and I think Sam was sort of the on-ramp to all that material for me. The films are about psychedelics mostly, and then sort of lead into a case for meditation. But psychedelics have been not as central as you might expect for me,
right,
except insofar as they sort of kicked me off on the path. The thing that got me more interested in psychedelics retrospectively was all the interesting neuroscience that was coming out about them, particularly expressed in this predictive processing paradigm. And then that becomes an interesting lens to understand the mind and religious phenomenology and eventually meditation also more generally. So
I'm glad you brought up predictive processing, because that's one of those topics, one of those theories that a lot of people have an intuition that, okay, this if there is ever a theory of everything, this is like one of the candidates, but nobody can explain it.
Yeah,
So,
bad sign.
So could you explain predictive processing? How is that different from like the free energy principle? How are these related to consciousness in the brain?
Oh boy. Okay, so I would tell people not to treat it as like a total theory of everything, just because you'll sort of be disappointed. And I think it's more interesting than that, but there is this line of critique of it that it's sort of like overly ambitious in its scope and maybe tautological and all sorts of other things. So I think be conservative in the initial interpretation of it, and then you'll get more of what's interesting without being too galaxy-brained about it. I'm not talking to you specifically. I'm just saying like one can think that way. Okay, so cluster of different related ideas. There's predictive processing, there's the Bayesian brain hypothesis, and then there's the free energy principle. And then there's maybe one more term that often comes up here called active inference.
Right.
And they're not all exactly the same thing, but they're related to each other. Which do you want me to get into first? Or what do you understand about them?
So let's start with the Bayesian brain, because my understanding of the Bayesian brain is this was the theoretical model that we've come to learn has its failures, that we can't account for combinatoric explosion of all the sense data we come into contact with and all the possible futures we could enact.
Right. Okay.
So we have to move past that.
Yeah. So people probably in your audience will be familiar with Bayesian epistemology more generally, and like probabilistic theories of how we make sense of the world. The Bayesian brain hypothesis is just that if perception and our general sense making of the world is a kind of inference, where we're getting limited data from the world, so we can't just read the data off the world directly, but we need to come to broader conclusions about it. The Bayesian brain hypothesis suggests that we might do that in a somewhat Bayesian way, where you have priors and you have evidence, and you're trying to marginally update your priors in relationship to the evidence, etc. So the Bayesian brain hypothesis is just the idea that maybe the way that the brain does inference is somewhat related to Bayes' theorem, or is according to Bayes' theorem. The reason why, that probably multiple reasons why, but one reason why traditional Bayesian inference doesn't work relates to a series of interests you and I have in common about John Vervaeke and relevance realization and combinatorial explosion that you mentioned. Let's see if I can get it right. Basically, to calculate Bayes' theorem directly, you would need to not only figure out what caused the sensory data, but consider all the possibilities of what might have caused it, which is a functionally infinite list from your point of view. So immediately it becomes computationally intractable.
Right.
But the math says Bayes is the optimal way to do it. So the question is, given that computational intractability limit, how do you approximate Bayesian inference in a way that finite beings like ourselves can actually manage? And that gets you this picture of, I guess it's like variational Bayesian inference, or variational, I'm not sure if actually these are the same thing. That is a story about how the brain does implement something approximating Bayesian inference that gets you into the predictive processing terrain.
Okay.
To sort of so and tell me if this is more sort of technical than you wanted.
No, as technical as you want.
In the film, I sort of take I do my best to not do violence to the technical explanation, but convey enough of the vibes level thing that you also sort of see its existential import. So in the language of the film, this inability to compute Bayes' theorem directly relates to the general paradox of beings like ourselves of being finite in relationship to the infinite, which is part of how I sort of narrativize psychedelics. So yeah, that's almost the only level at which you need to get it for the purpose of the film.
Okay, so it's an approximation on Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is basically the optimal way of updating your beliefs, also called priors, as you come across new information in the world. Now, the problem with positing that the brain is Bayesian fundamentally or in practice is there's just too many outcomes.
You can't calculate. You can't do it.
We don't have there's not enough compute, and so we have to approximate it somehow. And then the way the theory that tries to explain how we're approximating this is predictive processing.
No, but related. Okay, let's now do predictive processing.
Right.
Predictive processing is in the same sort of set of questions about perception as inference, but it's also based on a bunch of empirical observations that, for example, there are many more connections that flow in a certain in the sort of top-down direction than in the bottom-up direction in the brain, suggesting that we're not just doing this passive reading of sensory data off the world and then letting it travel up a few layers of processing to get the sort of high-level picture, but rather that we're expecting something from the world, predicting something about the world, and then updating those predictions at the margin in accordance with the sensory data that we get in a kind of hierarchical way. So you might get just the barest bit of light data from your actual eyes, but you come to vision with a prior expectation of what you're going to see. And then insofar as what that prediction would suggest the sensory data would be differs from what the actual sensory data is, then you update that prediction to try to better anticipate the sensory data you get later.
Yeah.
So that's predictive processing. There are different ways that might be implemented. It's just an idea about what the brain is doing when it's perceiving the world. The correction to the naive Bayesian inference thing and a particular story about how we do predictive processing, where you have a generative model, and then you use that generative model to predict what the sensory data might have been, etc. Those turn out to be the same math.
Interesting.
And that's the same math as the free energy principle. And so that's why these things all sort of get married, basically, and suggest something continuous about them.
Yeah, 100. And so what is the free energy principle? I hear people talk about it in the context of like surprise minimization.
Yes. Okay. So the free energy principle from a guy called Carl Friston is a theory about what any organism / thing in the limit case, like any bounded entity, must act as if it is doing if it's going to remain a bounded entity in the face of perturbations, or in the face of the second law of thermodynamics. So the background condition is that systems tend toward dissipation because of the second law. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to maintain some ordered structure as against those insults, then you have to exert work in order to do that. That's not going to be the natural tendency. The natural tendency is going to be toward equilibrium. And the free energy principle says that any system that does that, successfully does that over time, will behave as if, and this sort of as if bit is important, it has a model of its environment and is attempting to minimize prediction error with respect to that model. Surprisal is like, so surprisal is also another name for what you're minimizing, and variational free energy is another name for what you're minimizing. But those all have sort of like technical information theoretic descriptions. But surprisal is just, I think it's just synonymous mathematically with average entropy, or like average gap between what you expected you would get and what you actually get. Mm-hmm. So, but the free energy principle in some sense gets built bottom up from just like almost tautological claims about what any system must exhibit. And then the interesting thing is that math ends up meshing with this other math of that came from a more top-down perspective of like, how do brains make sense of the world? So you can see this sort of deep continuity between what any system must do in order to just exist and what brains are doing when they do this elaborate cognition, making sense of the world.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No. They're all related, and the math kind of converges. Mm-hmm. They all converge on similar descriptions in the math, which is, an indication that something deep is going on there. Yeah,
and to me, the reason that's like existentially interesting and not just like sort of like a happy coincidence is that much more about, this goes to this thing about the finite and the infinite, much more about our existential situation becomes clear when you realize that all of the sense-making we're doing, including this sort of high-level abstract cognition, has at its root the situation of being a bounded finite thing in relationship to a world whose entropy you could never assimilate totally.
Yeah, I know Jordan Peterson talks about religious wisdom and religious experiences in this context, where it's like trying to make sense of the fact that we're finite beings in an infinite world, in a world of infinite complexity. And it's just like, that's not just theoretically true, it's practically true. Like you can't compute all the possible paths. You don't have the compute to do it. So you have to make sense of that, of your way in the world, given that high degree of uncertainty.
Exactly. Yeah. We can go as far down the Peterson rabbit hole as you'd like, or not. You lead the way.
Okay. Yeah. So there is one tension that comes up for me when I watch the film, but also when I talk to Buddhists in general, is Buddhists have this, they're trying to corral the troops behind getting back in contact with direct experience. It's the words the phrases they'll commonly use are, it's already there. You just have to remember what it's like to be in direct contact with experience. Or like the ego is like a conceptual scaffolding that you've tiled over on top of experience. And it's like a lot of the suffering comes from getting caught in the weeds there. But if you remove all of the conceptual scaffolding, if you see clearly, then you're all that's left is pure awareness. And all that's left is like this underlying sense of joy and bliss underneath that. However, I also, and I think you as well, have a little bit of a sympathy towards this like Jordan Peterson or like Pageau kind of Jungian style of thinking symbolically.
Yeah.
Thinking narratively. For me, these feel like they're in tension because one is like an abstraction, the other is direct experience, direct contact with reality. So how do you do you see this tension?
Yeah.
How would you resolve it?
Yeah. Okay. I do see the tension. There's also like you could say each of them is further in tension, or would seem to be further in tension with not even sort of narrative symbolic descriptions, but like rational, abstract, conceptual descriptions. It's
all abstract.
There's a sort of spectrum there. Just to go back to what the sort of central Buddhist claim actually is, because as I say, the film sort of takes you on an arc from psychedelic experience and what's transformative about psychedelics, like psychedelic experience, to a case for meditation, and particularly like the particular non-dual variant, so-called, of meditation that Sam is teaching in the app. The claim is not exactly that if you got rid of all the concepts, then you would be fine, because then enlightenment would just be you can't move or do anything or make sense of the world at all. And that's obviously not the condition that you want to end up in.
Right.
But that particular confusion does emerge from the way people first get introduced to these insights through psychedelics. So psychedelics often do precipitate the dissolution or loss of certain conceptual faculties, like I can't tell the boundary between myself, my body, and the world, for example. Like I would bump into something, I can't move, I'm just like lying still, or I don't remember who I am, or things like that. So those things actually can go away in a transient sense on psychedelics. And as you say, it seems to reveal to people, when it's not terrifying, a kind of intrinsic freedom to awareness that is available to notice in the absence of those things. But if you think about it, like that can't be what being a Buddha means. Then the Buddha wouldn't be able to speak or remember anything, or so it's a subtle distinction that people often get confused about when they have their sort of central experiences of freedom from the ego via psychedelics. The more subtle claim that the Buddha, I'm going to loop back around to your question about narrative elliptically. The more subtle claim that the Buddhists are making is that there's a particular way we reify concepts that does create this sort of tiling over experience where it's almost like they're no longer transparent to the infinite, or they're no longer transparent to the intrinsic freedom of awareness. And when Buddhists say that concepts are empty, or really phenomena, everything is empty, they're pointing to the absence of the particular characteristic that this reification imputes to phenomena that causes them to cloud over the intrinsic freedom of awareness. That was a bit of a mouthful, but do you
but make them a little bit more particular. What is this feature, that reification? Does suffering come from reification? Is that the thesis?
Yes. So the technical term in Buddhism is avidya, or which usually translates as ignorance. What are we ignorant of? We're ignorant of the fact that phenomena lack inherent existence, and we do this move of reification, of attributing inherent existence to phenomena. This is a whole rabbit hole. We could go down.
Yeah,
I'm very down.
Sure.
And that move is what turns appearances into a veil that clouds over the intrinsic freedom of awareness in a certain way. It's not the Buddhists in the audience will also say the awareness is empty and it's tricky. But that's what ignorance is. To make it more concrete, suppose you have an experience. You're sitting in meditation. Some unpleasant sensation arises. The sense you have is that I am something other than that experience in relationship to that experience. And then because that experience can be better or worse for this seeming subject, there arises this push and pull dynamic, like craving or aversion in relationship to it, all on the basis of the sense that when it arises as something other than what I am. So you can imagine if you pull it out, that pin of the attribution of inherent existence to that phenomenon, then there would be no basis on which for this push and pull that is the felt sort of it has to do with the suffering to arise. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, and then I'll loop back around to your other thought.
Is it because, so is the suffering emerging from the resistance to what is actually the case and a desire to bring about a change?
Yes, but that's easy to misinterpret. So it's not that if you were to get enlightened, you would cease to be able to change circumstances in the world, or cease to be motivated to change circumstances.
Right.
It has to do with this seeming but not actually real sense that you're other than what you're experiencing,
right,
and that you could change experience that has already arisen. Like that's it's very different than me being like, oh, my apartment is messy, I need to clean it up. You're like, I just need to accept that my apartment is messy. Right? That's not the move. It's more an experience arises. There seems to be a separate embattled subject within experience relating to the field of experience. And the sense that you could stand in a push-pull relationship to that is the misperception that
it's the dualist frame. It's the separateness. It's rather than kind of identifying with the broader sphere or the broader, I don't want to say theater, but the broader presentation of consciousness itself, you identify as like an observer therein.
Correct. Yeah, there seems to be an observer therein, other than the experience, and that's that can dissolve upon inspection.
Right, and all the Buddhist take is all there is experience.
Yes, I'm gonna resist the temptation to like make all the kind of qualifications that like a nitpicky Buddhist would make, but that's something like what's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then you were gonna tie it back a little bit.
Okay, so you had the sense that the Buddhist emphasis on meditative phenomenology, like direct experience, that term becomes tricky when you're talking about emptiness, because it's not that you're having like a direct knowledge of the outside world.
Right.
Exactly.
That's a Kantian point.
Yeah. So, but yeah, the meditative emphasis is different than this, you could say like Judeo-Christian, or like really you see it across religions, this sort of mythological narrative context in which the religious ideas get presented. I do think there's something of a tension there, and you see it in the way over time those mythological forms that are intended to, in almost like a kind of participatory way, evoke certain dynamics of experience,
like
end up getting and
guy who's
another
LLM,
another rabbit hole.
It's like an LLM.
End up getting hardened into things about which you should have beliefs as like independently existing entities, and then lose their connection to the phenomenology they're meant to evoke. And then that further happens in the sort of modernist fundamentalist case, where it's not even that you're really relating to them the way one relates to narrative, you're relating to them the way one relates to like science, and then that produces monstrosities.
I feel like the wisdom of within the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's this very strong pushback against idols, creating idols.
Yeah,
and it sounds like this is a sort of an updated version of that, where it's not like don't have an idol that is literally like a statue with a face. No, it's don't have an idol that you're worshiping that's a narrative or a concept you're reifying.
Yeah, I would
the
say
same dangers are there.
I would say like from the like core perspective, I would want to advocate for about non-dual awareness and emptiness and so forth. Virtually all expressions of religion are idolatrous in this particular sense, where they're if you trace this idea of idolatry not to just like you shouldn't make an image of the prophet or whatever, like don't make graven images. What does it actually mean? It's a certain way of relating to experience that makes it no longer transparent to transcendence, which is this reification point that I'm talking about.
So then how do you wield symbols in a way that's useful and truth preserving?
Now I'm intensely aware that this is not I haven't worked all of this out, so
that's fine.
Right? Yeah. But we're gonna have the galaxy brain, highly speculative conversation. Well, first is just understanding what narratives are and what they're for. So there's something about the particular modernist way of relating to knowledge that's like heavily propositional. That sort of it's interesting how people partition this, and they don't do this in every sphere of life. So nobody goes and sees a movie and says the value of this is contingent upon it being propositionally true. Exactly. They have the experience. But particularly in a religious sphere, I think to defend it against the feared loss of meaning that would come if it lost its numinous import, people tend to treat mythological narratives like scientific propositions, instead of reading stories the way they're meant to be read, which is that they carry you through. You identify often with the protagonist of the story, and then you, through being identified with them and sharing their goals in some way, are taken on a journey, like a sort of affective, motivational journey through a particular experience that causes you to then learn something about some way of acting in the world, some way.
Right, yeah, but it's inhabiting
Yeah,
the character. Vervaeke talks about this in the sense of like children in playing in the backyard. They'll put on a cape and they'll run around with their fist in front of them and they'll pretend they're Superman. They will see the world as if they were Superman. Or hunter gatherers will undergo some ritual and act as if they are the deer that they are hunting and try and see the world as if they were the deer themselves.
Totally.
It's a transformation of being. It's a transformation of how you interact with the world, of participation in the world.
Yeah, and your emotions are involved. Your sort of like existential sense of your identity is involved. All sorts of things beyond beliefs, you could say, about how the world is independently. There's more to say about what's going on with these especially deep sort of religious stories than that. But I think that's one point I would make.
So a question I have then is, I like the idea of being able to leverage identity versus being like super anti-identity. Don't identify with things. It's, it pushes you in a box. It can cause suffering, it causes cognitive dissonance. But I think a better view is to view identity as something to be leveraged, right? So I know in the context of moral philosophy, Christine Korsgaard talks about this when she's trying to give like an adaptation or an update to Kant's theory. She talks about the way you can ground normativity is by identifying as a rational agent. And insofar as you identify as a rational agent, you then see yourself as acting in justified manners. You see yourself as acting in ways which can be justified by reference to some principle. And then she, will go into what it means to be a principle, as being universalizable, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question I have for you is, how do you view identity? Is that something to be just thrown to the wayside, or is it something you can actually leverage to act morally, act rationally, act towards whatever goals you may have, or should we throw it all out?
Okay, these are tricky questions. You're like sort of throwing me the full. Yeah, it's great. Okay, so I guess part of what you're reacting to is a certain understanding of Buddhism, meditation, and so forth, where they're saying like identification is bad. Maybe also like Paul Graham type, keep your identity small type concerns or something like that. So I don't think that the not self insight that the Buddhists are pointing to would prevent this kind of identification as a rational agent in a relative sense that you're describing. So there's a very common kind of failure mode in Western interpretations of Buddhism where like the Buddhist means something very narrow and specific by the self that they're negating. Mm-hmm. And then that tends to get applied, this is actually related to the sort of psychedelics case, to the far more capacious Western notions or psychological notions or whatever else of a self, of an identity. And then they assume that the Buddhists are saying get rid of that. So for example, like, would the enlightened person remember their name or like be able to take on any given role in in a household or in a culture or in a society, like all these other senses of identity, or like just not be schizophrenic, like have an integrated personality to some extent. None of those things are directly being negated by the Buddhist claim that there's no self. It's a much narrower and subtler claim. That's actually kind of surprising because it feels from the posture of identification that you would lose those things if you did this sort of letting go gesture that the Buddhists or like somebody who's telling you how to go through a psychedelic trip might advise. It feels like you're going to lose everything. You're going to fall apart. And that's sort of what keeps this thing in place. But it's not actually true. Like, think about the people who, are to whatever degree advanced on the contemplative path. Maybe there are weird side effects, but they tend not to, like, for example, bump into things all the time because they can't tell the boundaries of their body or whatever else. So as a general point, I would just say like there's this translation issue.
Right.
Actually, Michael Taft and I did a podcast just trying to tease these two things out. Just like, what do the Buddhists mean by self and what's the Western conception of self? And they're different. Maybe re-ask the question about identification. Am I getting at what you're asking?
Yeah, I think in the water supply there's a lot of misconceptions around what involves the rejection of the self. Mm-hmm. I think you pointed out that a lot of the confusion around that comes from a misunderstanding about what Buddhists mean when they talk about the self.
Yep.
And it seems to be it's really this confusion about seeing yourself as separate from the sphere of consciousness itself. The dualist move.
That would be one way that you experience it.
Okay.
So there's this global claim about phenomena, which is that they are empty. They lack inherent existence. The sort of technical term for this, like svabhava, which means like own being. And then there is no svabhava, things are empty of that kind of thing, applied to the person is saying that the person has no self. So it's like the same thing that the Buddhists are saying about you, they're saying about the table, all phenomena, basically.
Okay.
But the way that gets experienced is as this loss of a sense of being a subject in relationship to experience in the head, often, that kind of thing.
One thing that I've always been confused about and potentially take issue with the Buddhist account of, I guess, phenomenology is this idea that there's no existence of objects.
It's not quite inherent existence.
But so let me just unpack the seeming of those claims and the issue I would take with that potential scarecrow is it seems like the Buddhism does not let you make inferences about patterns in awareness. Like if I see an apple from one vantage point and I see from another vantage point and I see it persist over time, I feel like I'm pretty justified in concluding that there is an apple.
Right. Okay.
But Buddhism would say, no, there is no inherent existence. What does inherent existence mean if not there is an apple?
Okay. So let me take something that I don't think you would necessarily disagree with. This idea of emptiness, particularly when you're sort of getting out of the realm of just like the next instruction that you would give somebody when they're meditating and into this sort of like, how can we philosophically systematize this? It's got a whole bunch of different levels and ways that it applies. But here's one. So you see the color of this particular bottle, right?
Yes.
You're having experience of the color.
Yep.
The color seems to be a property of the bottle.
Right.
Okay. Color, if you do this sort of physics-based analysis, isn't a thing that exists out there as what you perceive it to be. There's some interaction between what you're bringing to bear and what you're getting from the physics of things, if you want to use that story, that in that interaction, the phenomenology of color is produced. But it's not true to say that even when you do this sort of like wavelengths of light thing, it's not true to say that there's a direct correspondence between the exact physical wavelength of light and the experienced color, okay? But that's not immediately evident to you in direct experience. The way you experience it is the color inheres in the perception, which is in the object, which exists that way, as I perceive it, out there from its own side, right? That's the emptiness negation. And then it turns out that every property that you'd want to ascribe has a bit of that characteristic. I'll take it from another angle so you can sort of see. You know this Thomas Nagel book, The View from Nowhere? Okay. What's he critiquing in that? The idea that there can be such a thing as a view from nowhere. I mean, like, Nagel has, he's more rational, sympathetic in some ways, but the idea of a view from nowhere suggests that there's sort of like an a-perspectival take on a situation or reality. But if you break it down into like perceptual phenomena, for example, does it make sense to say that there's some way that something inherently looks? It's not quite the right concept, right? Looking implies vision, which implies a certain kind of organism that has the visual faculty, and vision is bound up with, again, like the affordances of that particular organism and so forth. Like what particular kind of thing you are determines how you're going to see the world. So the idea that something looks a particular way from its own side, independent of the kind of thing you are, is a misperception. Does that make sense?
Right. Okay. Right. It's positing separate existence to
So
phenomena.
that's this idea, like there's no inherent existence.
Oh, inherent means like separate. Okay.
Yeah.
So, standalone.
Like a svabhava, own being, like from its own side.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the radical part of that claim is that goes we tend to stop that analysis at various places or just like bracket it most of the time. But it actually goes all the way down. So like cups lack inherent existence, colors lack inherent existence, all the things that you want to like we tend to do this reductive move and go, okay, yes, this high level concept maybe doesn't inherently exist, but there's some fundamental level.
Right. And
the radical thing would be to say, no, it runs all the way down. And that leaves you in this interesting position where, from a relative perspective, you can say all these different things. And there's I am not, and I don't think the Buddhist claim is that you have to be impartial among them, right? You don't have to be like, anybody's claim about the color of this bottle is as good as anybody else's. I don't think that's right. But you can't do this claim of this particular phenomenology is the way it inherently is from its own side. And that removes a certain kind of existential foundation.
Just taking subjectivity seriously. It's underscoring the claim that like all that there really is experience.
It's not saying all there is experience, because that would be to make some
things that exist
reificatory, like saying like that would get you into this direct experience trap of you go, yeah, the bare phenomenology that discloses how the thing actually is. Right. I have direct knowledge. It's like a weirder claim than that. It's a subtler claim. Yeah, like so for example, like it's actually saying your experience of this cup isn't how it inherently is. So it's not saying, you see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't forbid, at least like not all schools, would forbid the idea of there being an external world. But it's just saying, insofar as you're having an experience of it, it's mediated.
It's just recognizing that it's all an emergence in your own experience. And it may or may not generalize. It may or may not be instantiated external to you. Or you don't know it is, or it's not at all.
Yes. Yeah. Let's see if it comes back around. It's a weird claim to talk about divorced from a particular kind of experience that you might have in meditation, and then it's like less weird after that. But here's an example, and feel free to pivot me if it becomes more than your interest level. But like, okay, you're having a pain in your knee. The pain seems to exist on its own side. You're sitting there meditating. You have a pain in your knee. You are subject to that pain, so it feels. It's over there, you're over here in some inscrutable way, and it's happening to you, and it exists as an object of your experience. Okay, but then you go, what if I were just like embrace this a little bit more? Not only does that change your relationship to the experience, it will change the way the experience arises. That's kind of interesting. Change something on your side.
Not positing it as separate to you.
Well, it just taking on a different way of looking in like Robert Bea jargon changes how it appears. So that's interesting. And then imagine you do that with like 1,000, this is what Robert Bea does in Seeing This Book, Seeing That Freeze, is he just gives you a whole bunch of different ways of looking. So try looking at this way, try looking at this way, and then practice that over time. You will notice that there's no stable characteristic that survives across all of those different ways of looking. Which doesn't mean that you just get to decide what you experience. Like in limited cases you can, but like if you just go, I want perfect bliss to arise right now in exactly this place, in exactly this way. You don't have that kind of freedom, exactly. But nor is it ever the case that the way the phenomena arises will survive all possible ways of looking and exist and present the same way. And that is like the meta insight that can emerge from doing that a bunch of different ways is that phenomena are empty, that they don't exist from their own side. Does that make sense?
That was great.
Okay. Yeah.
That was great. Yeah.
That's like Robert Bea 101. That's his big way of pitching emptiness.
The Platonist in me wants to say something like, given that you don't have absolute freedom to make phenomenology how you want, there's still, when you take a vantage point, there's still going to be some like structural relation between all the phenomenon, and like you take a different vantage point, there's still structural. So it seems like there's like an implication that there is an underlying structure behind it. But Buddhists don't like to talk about that, or how do they
just have a different project,
right?
So the Buddhist project is not the same as the scientific project.
Okay.
The scientific project, one way of describing it, this is sort of like a Buddhist way of describing it, but it would be like you're trying to shear away the particularities of any given perspective to arrive at some account of what's out there on its own, like objectively, so to speak, in a way that's as context and purpose and person and perceiver independent as possible.
Right.
Okay. The Buddhists are just trying to free you from suffering. Like that's their game. And they're not totally non-overlapping projects. Like I'm not saying the Buddhist view has nothing to say about the scientific project, but you're not trying to do the same thing.
Right. On the point of the Buddhist project trying to alleviate suffering, this is more of a normative question or a moral question, but is that all that actually matters?
I'm loving the extremely direct solve moral philosophy now questions. No, I wouldn't say that. I don't think it's all that actually matters. It's really tricky too, because even the Buddhist sort of like trying to get to the end of dukkha thing, most really advanced meditators will say there's a certain point at which you sort of solved the suffering problem to such an extent that it ceases to be relevant and other things are concerning you in some way. So like,
Wow.
it's almost like your sense of what suffering was changes. And like particularly sort of late and radical non-dual Buddhist views like Dzogchen, which is to some extent the context that Sam Harris is coming out of, don't really talk about suffering at all. It's weird. You can, at least I think you can translate them, or at least like see how they're continuous with earlier forms of Buddhism where it's all about suffering and the end of suffering. But they're coming from a particular view where that's not as relevant as it once was, but also because you solved it to a substantial degree.
That's fascinating because one of the approaches that I like to grounding normativity is what I would call valence realism, which is to say that within perception there just is this things do appear as good or bad or better or worse, or things at which you have a reason to bring about and things in which you have a reason to avoid.
Yeah.
Right? There's like normativity is inherent to perception itself. The downstream consequence of that is that if valence is all that normativity is grounded in, then valence is all that really matters. And valence is kind of like somewhat synonymous with like well-being or flourishing or like complex forms of pleasure.
Yeah.
So my intuition was always that if you create like a Buddhist ethics, you end up with a sort of utilitarian ethics.
Yeah. Oh man, you're like scratching at a thing that it's very like earth shaking from my point of view, because there's a very tricky paradox there where I totally know what you mean. That point of view on things is consistent with how I was viewing the meditative project. Is like it's the Buddhist emphasis on suffering and the end of suffering is kind of like valence realist consequentialism in some ways. And similar types of minds, especially in a modern context, gravitate towards. I think they're different, and it's weird and interesting. Why? So take this emptiness claim. Valence realism, in this really ultimate sense, and emptiness can't quite go together. Right. And I think this is if I could sit down Sam Harris and like have a long conversation with him about a particular thing, this would be one of the things.
This would be the moral landscape.
Yeah, the moral landscape is basically, I'm very sympathetic to this kind of case. I really like it, right? So it's basically a valence realist, consequentialist story about what matters morally. What matters, like it's sort of got an ontology that reduces to two types of things: ontologically objective things and ontologically subjective things, namely conscious states. Conscious states can be intrinsically better or worse in some way.
Right.
And then our job is to navigate in the space of possible conscious states toward what's better. I don't want to totally negate that. Like, I think that's like right in some deep way, or like I share a ton of those intuitions. But this emptiness thing does sort of unpick it gradually. And then the question is, where does that leave you in relationship to all of sort of consequentialist ethics? The one way I would start to mess with it is that initial ontology of things are either subjective or objective. The ontologically subjective stuff is conscious states, and the ontologically objective stuff is like the physics of things. I don't think that holds up either, or at least like that creates a bunch of problems. It's one of the things I think that the hard problem emerges out of, is that move. And that particular way of dividing things comes out of a particular modernist posture that like reifies those two ontologies as being substantial. And I don't think that survives the emptiness claim. There are a few different ways I can pick this up. Tell me which one's more interesting to you. If I say like meaning is neither subjective nor objective but interactive, is that
transjective?
Yeah, I want to hold on to this interactive idea because it gives you an intuition. But does that make sense? Like, do I need to argue for that, or is that true? Okay. What falls under the bucket of meanings to you?
I mean, I'm pretty Vervaeke pilled, so I kind of just adopt his definition, which is meaning is a sense of connectedness to something that is external to you, that is bigger than you, and something you deem as morally important.
Okay, so I would call that like existential meaning.
Okay.
I'm using, when I say meaning is neither subjective nor objective but interactive, includes that kind of thing, but I'm using it way more spaciously to include all your ways of making sense of the world.
Oh, okay.
So like perceptions are a kind of meaning.
Like a meaningful, like to make sense of something.
Yeah, it's like ways of taking the world to be intelligible or something.
Okay, yeah.
Like
you don't see a door hinge. You see like a tool that you can
tool and
use
obstacle,
to open
all of
a
that
door,
kind of thing. Yeah.
right?
So and there's this sort of story of how these higher level meanings would emerge out of really lower level meanings, which are just implications for action. So you can think about a very simple organism that has a reflex arc, where in some way the world bumps into them, and just based on the way that they're structured, that causes them to act in, like an amoeba or something like that, that like has like following certain gradients, and the things that are literally bumping up against the membrane, that kind of thing. Or if I hit your knee with the hammer, the stimulus, like in a doctor's office, the stimulus of the sensation will cause you to kick in a way that doesn't get mediated through anything. It's just a reflex arc, right? You could say the meaning of that sensation to you is the action that it produces in some narrow way. But then if you move that through complex hierarchical cognition, there's all this mediation in between the mere perception and the mere action that makes meaning a more complicated story. But the ways in which you find the world intelligible, goes to the Vervaeke point, are, at least some of them are related to the kinds of actions you might take. So I've used this analogy in so many places that I'm a little bit sheepish about it now, but like if you take this cup and think about what must be true of it for you to give it the ontology of cup. This relates to the emptiness claim. It's that part of that is that it's graspable to you, which is not inherent to the cup from its own side. It has to do with the kind of thing that you are and what is graspable for you that leads that ontology to be a relevant way for you to make sense of the world. And you can see how that like emptiness is sort of implied in that to some extent, right? Like you say it's objectively a cup. Well, hold on a second. If you weren't the kind of thing that could grasp cups, it wouldn't be a cup for you.
Or if someone's breaking in your house, that's now a weapon.
Exactly. Yeah, right, exactly. It's not right to say that that's subjective either. So take an affordance style representation. Something is graspable. It's not true that it's objectively graspable in the sense of objective being from its own side. Nor is it true to say that it's subjectively graspable, because you couldn't just decide what's graspable and what isn't. Yeah. Right? It's not arbitrary. So it exists in this weird middle ground that we don't have nice accounts for in a kind of modernist ontology of being neither subjective nor objective and interactive. Now imagine that all meanings, including things like valence, fall within that weird category. You can't give them substantial existence by just saying they intrinsically are better or worse because they are made of a substance that I've attributed solid existence to, namely consciousness or matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So this doesn't eliminate valence. It just says it's not an objective quality out in the world or out in your head. It's about a participation between, you know.
It's not an objective quality, nor is it a subjective quality.
Right. It exists within the participatory dance between, you know, don't crucify me for this, subject and object.
Yeah. No, I won't. And when I'm like being nitpicky, it's not that I don't know what you mean or that you're like describing it badly. It's just like it's weird. It's really like, and I'm mindful of certain nitpicky people in the audience.
Right.
Exactly that. Okay.
Okay. So, but then this doesn't eliminate valence, realism, and consequentialism. It's just being honest about the fact that it's not like an objective quantity on the world.
Yeah,
valence.
But it does remove your ability to, I guess, like be a certain kind of moral realist. And I am a certain kind of moral realist, but it like there's a particular variant of trying to answer this question of moral realism that inherits the foundationalist project that I think like emptiness and other things like Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and so forth negate.
Is the issue with foundationalism, or is the issue with like objectivity, like this robust realism?
I think they're related. So there's realism as the claim that like there is a world. Okay, just like in the most vague terms. I'm not going to specify anything about it, but there is a there's something. The way I like to think about it, this is from this guy Brian Campbell Smith. There's something in deference to which our objectifications exist.
Right.
So it's like, you know, when word and world, he says, when word and world part company, trust the world. Like there's some sense of like I'm accountable to something when I objectify. that, whatever that is, to which I'm accountable. I'm leaving it vague because any specific way you account for it isn't it. This is related to your idolatry thing earlier, right? And that way of describing it makes it way more compatible with, translatable into religious intuitions than it would seem initially.
The Tao that can be named is not the Tao.
It is related to that.
It's giving that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So to go to your like interest in analytic philosophy, moral realism, and so forth. Part of this question about like this way of framing the issue of moral realism versus moral anti-realism. Part of the reason that comes up is you have a world picture where the only thing that is like reasonably allowed to push back is the physics of things, because the world we inhabit, or that to which we exist in deference, becomes just physics, right? And so it makes sense for the person to say, like, you're wrong about the physics of things, which is taken to have an inherent nature that pushes back if you're wrong about it. But morality isn't out there in the physics of things pushing back. So in what sense can you make right or wrong claims about moral? So like that particular dilemma of like moral realism versus moral anti-realism emerges from the fact that like morality can't be quote unquote objective in the way that we think physics is, but it doesn't seem right to say that you just get to decide arbitrarily.
Right.
So in deference to what do moral judgments exist? The reason why I think you can stop me if
I was going to say, this is reminding me of the earlier point about as you make all these frame shifts, the Buddhists want to say, as you make these frame shifts, there's no inherent existence to these objects. You can take them to be different things in various frames, and there's no like fixed point along which you can kind of, that is maintained as you shift between all these like coordinate transformations. And the point I was making earlier was the Platonist in me wants to go, okay, but as you make a frame shift, there's still a structure that emerges. You take a different frame, there's now another structure that emerges. You take another frame shift, there's still a structure. Now, structures may be all different, but there is still a structure there. And so I think it doesn't seem unreasonable to make inferences that there are like inherent structures prior to our perception of these objects. And so I think when you can take this in the moral domain and say there may be inherent structures to, let's say, the nature of, and this is a Kantian point, agency in the world, or consciousness and valence, or something to this effect, or how you participate in a society. This is like a McIntyre sort of point. There still are structures underlying that, and just because you can shift frames and there's no like kind of fixed points there, it doesn't mean there's no inherent structures. So there still is some sort of objective prior to structure, prior to perceiving things. It can just shift and change as you move around.
Okay, the part of this intuition that I share is what I want to call like the deference. Okay, so like and the non-arbitrariness, basically.
Right.
Like it's not that you can just go and say anything, right, about the world and how it is, and have it be equally good, or equally worthy. So the function that a claim like there's inherent structure is playing, or the role it's playing, is, well, hold on, we can't just be willy-nilly here. Like there's something out there that our perceptions are responsive to, or something, or like attempting to mirror, and I think that's fine. I think that's right. It's tricky to say of any particular way that you conceptualize the world that is getting at what it's like inherently, because it's to my eye, it's not that it's wrong in a way that could be right. It's kind of a category error, because again, it's like saying there's a way that the world objectively looks,
right,
or sounds, or any pick the sensory faculties. Like, is there a way that a table objectively feels from its own side? Well, no, hold on. Feeling is doing this kind of thing. It's not that kind of thing. And I think abstract concepts are emergent from, not my idea, but like that kind of concrete interaction. So for example, when forming an object representation, part of what you're doing is forming a sense of what it would look like visually from multiple different vantage points. That's like involved in your object. But like, when you reduce the properties that seem to be there in your sense of objects, they all come down to things like well, if I reached for it, I could grab it. Or if I saw, like, you see what I mean? Like it's got that kind of like tactile, interactive property. Not, and it's wrong to call those kinds of things what the world is like from its own side, without your
There's no so it's not the claim isn't more so, and I'm
all of this, by the way, like I think a very robust science survives every claim I'm making.
Right.
And I hate when people pretend it doesn't.
Right,
So like
right.
I'm not making some like from my point of view radical relativist claim that makes like projects like science or even projects like a certain kind of moral universalism make sense. I actually think I can like particularly in the moral case, we'll get back to the valence realism thing and all of that. Like, there's a way this redeems a bunch of that stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not making a anti-science point.
Well, I mean, it is very consistent with science because even we've known this since relativity that okay, there are still objectively true claims that you can make within a physical system. It just depends on your vantage point. And the measurements will be different depending on your vantage point, whether you're moving close to the speed of light, whether you're near a large mass of energy or mass or gravitational well. But there's still correct measurements and predictions you can make within that vantage point. It still depends on the vantage point.
Yeah.
But they're still correct. And so where I'm kind of gesturing at with this is within certain vantage points, what appears as better and worse may change, and there's perhaps no fixed point, but there's still an objective, or that's a bad word, but there's still a fact of the matter, right? It's like,
well, but is there a fact about? Okay, so think about this idea that there's an objective valence. What does that mean?
It's the claim, but it's paying deference to the fact that it depends on your vantage point first. But within a vantage point, and within maybe even a certain frame of looking at the world, things do present themselves as positive valence.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. It doesn't give a kind of ultimate existence valence that is. I mean, like one of the things that the consequentialist intuition works. Again, I share this intuition. Like I'm basically a consequentialist. Like I like to like joke that I'm like a closet, like just like hardcore utilitarian.
I know. Like everyone's pushed to that if you actually think about it long enough.
I'm not just EA adjacent. I'm actually like EA sympathetic. So, like that kind of thing. But maybe you can help me make sense of it. But part of the consequentialist intuition is to look at other ways of doing moral reasoning, and like for example, divine command ethics or something like that, and say, hold on, this is predicated on stuff that isn't real.
Right.
That makes your moral claims kind of shaky. And then say, what's real once we get down to brass tacks? Well, experience is real and physics is real. And I don't think that like for a bunch of purposes, that's really helpful. And I'm not saying we should just like revert to divine command ethics, but I don't think that like reified twofold ontology of what gets to count as real is right.
You don't think physics and experience is like your ontology is not real? That's not the correct ontology? Why? Because it's dualist, or
it produces a bunch of problems to say there are two inherently existing substances, the interaction between which we have no sense of. Okay, I'm gonna give you a parable that I like give to like as an intuition pump for this kind of thing, and it's like there's no anthropological realness to this, but I like it. Imagine you live in like a sort of tribe, in like you're an archaic person living in a tribe. You have a totem pole at the center of town. I don't know why it's a totem pole, whatever. Okay, and you've only ever grown up in that community. And from your point of view, the totem pole is inherently sacred. The sacredness is a property of the totem pole in the same way that green feels like it's a property of this cup. Okay, and everybody around you treats the totem pole as sacred. And when you experience the totem pole, you experience its sacredness. Okay, then you have an encounter with somebody from another tribe for whom the totem pole is not experienced as sacred. First thing you do, probably like kill each other or like fight, right? Like fuck you, it's sacred. Okay, but eventually, over time, you're forced to differentiate your sense of sacredness from inhering in the object, which it seemed to initially. Like you go, okay, hold on, sacredness isn't the kind of thing that's out there in the totem pole. There's something about it, because if it were out there in the totem pole, the other guy from the other tribe would experience it. So it's got to live somewhere else. and like somebody like Charles Taylor will like notice a macro historical trend of like the meaning retreating from the objects and kind of going into subjective when these kinds of encounters between cultures occur. And you can think about like something like that encounter is what's going on in science, where you go like, hold on, we can't triangulate this particular perception across two different observers. So whatever can't be triangulated across, for example, different times running the experiment or different observers or whatever, can't be there, right, on its own side. And then you imagine stretching that kind of process over a bunch of instances and a bunch of time. That's what I think gets you this sense of there are two ontologies. The purely subjective,
interesting,
to which you can have no access, and I can only have a certain kind of direct access, and the purely objective, which just exists from its own side in exactly that way. But like sacredness isn't like that, for example. And I would say nothing is like that. Like color is not like that, etc.
So these things exist in relation.
Yeah, like this Chapman refrain of meaning is neither subjective nor objective but interactive.
Right.
That's the kind of thing I would want to say.
Okay, so let me.
Is this making any sense?
No, it's making perfect sense. I just want. I wanted.
Is it also answering your question, or am I taking you way far afield?
No, this is good. I do want to see if we can find some common ground on like this Valence realist project, accounting for emptiness before we move on, which is, there's still facts of the matter as to what is positive valence within a certain frame, and you can shift frames, and you can shift perspectives, and you can move from one head to another, and the valence structure may be different, but within each frame, well, actually, this is a good question. Is the one constant within all of these frames that, like, how do I put this? Positive valence is good, or
this is where
it's hard to poke at this because this is a bedrock concept that you can't really define without being circular.
And also, so there's a term in a meditation context called Vedana, which is translated usually as feeling tone, which is something like valence. It's like is experience positive, negative, or neutral?
Right.
Like when you're doing kind of meditative deconstruction, one of the things you're seeing the emptiness of is Vedana, right? So like you can notice, for example, that like change your relationship to the object, its valence in that sense changes. But why are you up to this whole awakening project in the first place? Like why would you want to awaken, basically? There's some difficult to categorize sense in which being awake is better. And certainly like it doesn't feel weird to describe in terms of like it's a better experience, better valence, you might say, than the other condition. So it's weird. Like the relationship of the awakening project to valence realism is weird because in some way the progress has to do with seeing as empty a bunch of things that you were taking to have inherently existing valence. But then doing that more and more produces a better and better experience. So I have not worked this out at all. At all. Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to find is maybe one fixed point, which I would call like an intuitive or a non-natural fact or an intuition about value, which is that like positive valence is good, or that positive valence gives you reason to bring about more of it. Like these are like kind of baseline statements that even as you that appears to be frame invariant. Even though the things which appear as positive valence may shift, the fact that positive valence does present itself as giving you a reason to bring about more of it remains.
I in like 90% of cases agree with this.
Oh god, okay. So like, no fixed points.
Well, I'm like accurately representing here that I haven't figured this out.
Yeah.
Because I noticed that like I have different intuitions that clash here. So like I'm like basically just a consequentialist, and that doesn't square with other things that I think about ontology. So I haven't worked this out yet at all. Let me take you down one more rabbit hole and see if it just sort of shakes this up more. You'll see what I'm like struggling with a little bit. Okay, there's this guy I love called Brian Cantwell Smith who recently died, analytic philosopher. But interestingly, and I think like relevantly for his ideas, his father was a very famous theologian named Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And Brian got his PhD in computer science, but then became a philosopher to try to figure out what the hell is actually going on with computation when he realized that like it was not as settled as everybody thought it was. So there's like a computer science education, very technical, became a philosopher, father's a theologian. And all of these things are relevant to, I think, understanding where he ended up, a bunch of his ideas. Brian was very concerned with what in like philosophy of mind jargon is called intentionality, which is this like, it's not intending to do X or Y. It's not like a kind of agency thing. It's directedness, the sense in which, or like aboutness, or the sense we have that, like I was saying before, our thoughts are accountable to something because they're about those things or in relationship to those things.
Right.
He thought that this was like constitutive of minds. They're intentionally directed. In interpreting a bunch of kind of insults to the rationalist tradition in philosophy that happened in the 20th century, he's noticing that like one of the things that the rationalist frame left out, and particularly the one that got picked up in computer science, the version of it that got picked up in computer science, was this capacity for intentional directedness. So early logic, I'm going to get this wrong. We've now gone very far afield, but I think you're the one to do it with. If you think about like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is about what way of manipulating propositions you can, what rules for manipulating propositions are truth preserving.
Right.
Not just within the formal system of the symbols, but in relationship to the things the symbols are about.
Right, there's like a world that's posited.
Exactly.
This corresponds to.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And like that, the manipulation that you're doing on the symbol side, be truth preserving, is accountable to the world, not to anything internal to the symbol manipulation. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So logic had this kind of intentional directedness, but then Brian would say when it got picked up in computer science, it sort of lost that, and the semantics got reinterpreted as like what happens when you run the program and things like it got interpreted to like things that are intrinsic to the formal symbol manipulation. And he's like, they lost the intentional directedness of this original conception of logic. And all right, let me see if I can do this quick enough to bring it back around to what you're actually asking about. There's a similarity there to this sense in which moral realism versus anti-realism is about this question of like whether our moral claims are in deference to anything or intentionally directed toward anything. And what Brian eventually argued was that even bare truth claims, for a whole bunch of reasons having to do with like Wittgenstein, like later Wittgenstein type arguments, we can get into it. Even bare truth claims imply a kind of intentional directedness, which is normative, such that you can't just get truth and reference without including this kind of intentionally directed normative commitment to like the transcendent in some way.
Yeah.
And then he kind of uses that as like a pry bar to say, actually, we need to, like the apparent case where we've got truth and reference figured out for the physics of things, but the moral domain, normativity, and mattering and all this stuff, that's not figured out. That's not true. It's like the truth claims of rationalist science depend upon normativity in a way that you can't escape. And that opens the door back up to like mattering in general.
Right. This is a project I've been working on, I guess more in private as well, which is truth for me doesn't make sense without reference to some underlying world of the some underlying structure, I would say.
Okay.
Right. And when it comes to science, right, there's a stance in the philosophy of science called structural realism, which basically posits that, okay, we can't know things inherently. This is a Kantian point. We don't know what an electron is in and of itself, intrinsically.
Yeah.
But we can know how it behaves in relation to other things, other measurables, right? So we have this like structural relation that we can tease apart through experiment, and the truth claims of science are true in virtue of this structure. Mm-hmm. And so if you take that to the moral domain, and with a little bit of acknowledgement to like this intentionality thing you're describing, is if normativity, if there are true normative claims, they're going to be true in virtue of some structure. It's like, what could this structure possibly be, right?
Indeed.
What could it possibly be? It's not like out in the world,
Yeah.
And it seems like what you're saying is it's also not just inherent to consciousness itself. It has to be a relational, a participatory feature. It has to be inherent to a participation between a subject and an object. The structure that normative claims are true in virtue of have to be something inherent to the web of connections between the subject and the object. And this is where I think maybe a Kantian perspective makes more sense, because it talks about grounding normativity in agency. And agency doesn't make sense if you don't have, as you described earlier, like this boundary between the subject and the object, or the subject and the world, right?
Yeah.
So it's that the structure is somewhere, draw a big circle around that picture. Some Markov blanket here, the world out there, and it's like in here in this interconnected
Good job
web.
bringing the free energy principle back into it. Yeah.
And it's somewhere between in this picture is a structure that normativity is true in virtue of. That's as far as I've gotten.
I think something like that is right.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar enough with the sort of Kantian lineage to like have a real opinion about it. But that kind of thing I think is right. Like I don't think, insofar as what you just said is something like cashes out as morality is not arbitrary, and there's something to which our moral claims are in deference to, and to use the language I was using before. I think that's right. I think that's definitely right and important.
Okay,
I think we can agree about that.
I think we're getting close. We haven't, none of us have figured it out, but we're
just,
like directionally.
The only reason I'm pushing on this is not because like I find the like consequentialist intuition, for example, or Kantian intuition, like obviously wrong or something like that. But I noticed that in order to like take things from Jung or from like religious mythology or whatever else, a lot of like translation, like inferential distance has to be covered, such that I'm like trying to find the bridging languages that makes them translatable into each other and not like intrinsically clashing.
Okay, you had a fever dream about this.
yeah, sort of.
Build the bridge between Jung and analytic philosophy, or
I don't know that I can do it cleanly, but I introduced part of it, which is this Brian Cantwell Smith thing. For people who want to like follow up on this, I'm sure I'll tweet about it. Brian has these two papers. One is a paper, one is a talk. The paper is called God Approximately, and the talk is called Deference, Humility, Awe. We'll come back to this. But Brian is working within an analytic tradition, so he's not like, he's palatable to people with that cast of mind. Jung, okay. Haven't read a ton of Jung, find him hard to read. We were talking about this earlier. The understanding I'm about to present comes mainly from this guy, Edward Edinger, who's Jung's main kind of American interpreter, one of his main interpreters, in this book called Ego and Archetype. Okay, so Jung had this idea that the ego individuates in relationship to something he called the self. I think somewhat misleadingly called the self, but which is this kind of regulative center / totality in relationship to which individuation occurs. And the self is what the God image is sort of about in Jungian, in a Jungian account, which is why, like, well, yeah, I mean, I'll leave it at that. So the self is the thing that the God image is supposed to make it possible for you to interface with in some way. But the self has all these sort of connotations. It contains all the opposites, Jungian language, and it contains the ego, so it's like vaster than the ego. But it's the thing that like it also contains the shadow. It contains like the opposite side of everything that you've made the positive characteristics of the ego. On a Jungian account, we start existence, think about the baby, like with inflated participatory identification with the self, where you haven't developed a sense of yourself as an individuated finite thing yet. But you're not like, it's not like you have like a explicit sense that you are God or totality or something like that. It's just that you like haven't made it conscious yet. And then this is very similar to many other developmental accounts, but like in relationship to the what psychoanalysts would call like the necessary failure of the mother. So the ways in which once you're born, the mother ceases to instantaneously meet all your needs the moment they arise. That's part of what you develop a sense of a separate self in relationship to, is that you're not the totality, and therefore you have limits, and therefore your desires can be thwarted, and that's how you start to build a sense of yourself as a separate thing. Okay. That's a kind of initial letdown of what Jung would call inflation, which is the identification of the ego, the finite individual self, with the self, the thing in relationship to which it individuates the totality. And so you think you're that, and then you get let down, and then the sort of cramp of self-consciousness, and then you discover the limits, and then that keeps happening over time. But that initial wound of that first, oh, I'm not God, in some way that the infant experiences, carries with you through the rest of life. Jung would talk about this in the fall, right, from the Garden of Eden, this sort of alienation from God. And then like a functioning psyche, he would say, has an ego self axis. So you retain the sense of connection to transcendent totality. But we tend to oscillate in practice between extremes of inflation, like appropriating to yourself the divine will, like I'm immortal or whatever. Like there are more and more subtle manifestations of this, or extremes of alienation, where you lose the sense of the self-axis and you're like, I'm cut off from the divine. So again, think about like the Eden myth. Adam and Eve are in the garden, walking with God. They're connected to God. Their needs are effortlessly met. They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Attempting to become as gods, right? And then that's the inflation. And then that leads them to be cast out of the garden, which precipitates this period of alienation from God that's got to later be redeemed by Christ in the Christian account, right? So that's the kind of thing he has in mind, okay? So from inflation to the letdown of inflation to the experience of alienation, and then the restoration of the ego self-axis in Jungian language, okay? Jung would say that a healthy ego self-axis is core, central, necessary to like a functioning psyche. It's almost like synonymous with a functioning psyche. That's kind of the same thing as this intentional directedness deference thing that we've been getting at in another lexicon. So like it's essential that to the experience of meaning in this existential sense that we were talking about earlier, that you feel like your ways of finding the world intelligible exist in deference to and in right relationship to this thing that transcends them, to which they're accountable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. To loop everything back around to this film and to Peterson and predictive processing and so forth. Okay. In the film, I have this predictive processing story that all the interesting, or much of the interesting psychedelic neuroscience is expressed in terms of, and then because I'm doing this trading back and forth between psychedelic/religious phenomenology and the neuroscience, I'm using the way that Peterson does this kind of bridging between these two things as my translation key in some way.
Right.
But one thing that's interestingly parallel is that on a predictive processing account, you can imagine some way in which all of cognition is kind of organized around this encounter with anomaly, right? So like the prediction error, the gap between what you expected you would get and what you get, and then different magnitudes of that and different depths of that experience of the encounter with anomaly. And all of the sort of hierarchy of cognition is organized around resolving, containing, limiting the extent of that possible encounter with anomaly. This is like the complexity management thing we're
Reducing valve.
Yeah, I use Huxley's analogy of like a reducing consciousness, a reducing valve, to talk about this kind of thing. And then on psychedelics, when you relax the precision weighting or lower the confidence with which you're holding your priors, this religious sense of the mysterium tremendum floods back in, such that reality is suddenly like numinous, sacred, but also like potentially threatening,
right,
reemerges, because your ability to kind of contain it with these conceptual structures has diminished. That idea that shows up in predictive processing as everything is organized around minimizing prediction error in a kind of hierarchical way, and then if you relax the precision or predictions, the mysterium tremendum comes flooding back in, is very similar, maybe the same, as what Jung is talking about when he talks about the ego self axis, the importance of the ego self axis being functional. And you heard this Jung line, all religion is like a defense against an encounter with God.
Oh wow.
It's a very interesting like phrase, right? Because you think like the religious structure exists to give you an encounter with God, but actually he's like the dogmatic structure is protecting you against. It's keeping those archetypal energies, you could say, present to consciousness and causing you to participate in them, so as to protect you from that bare, unfiltered encounter with the mysterium tremendum that all of your cognition is organized around avoiding, right? But if you don't have that participatory engagement with those kinds of things, you also lose the ego self access, he would say, or like the connection to God, and that's dysfunctional also. So you're engaged in this sort of titrated exposure thing. You get I don't know where I want to land this plane, but you get where I'm going. Like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is the
yeah.
connected set. So like it's connected to this deference idea and the sense that there's something to which we're accountable, because that's the source of this encounter with the limitations of your predictions.
Yeah.
It's connected to this predictive processing story, and it's connected to this sort of Jungian account of the sacred. Okay.
That was great. That was great. Well, one of the things I really wanted to ask you was, so your background, you've had a new atheist phase, or still
my enduring new atheist phase.
you're
Yeah.
still in your new atheist phase. But there's a common trajectory for people who are like really online, going from like this, maybe they grew up religious and then they, go through a new atheist phase and they become rationalists and then they become, they take psychedelics and then they get into meditation and then they become like neo-Buddhists
And then they
like
become Orthodox Christians.
and then they become
Yeah,
Orthodox,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
That trend is definitely real, but the abstraction of that trend is this move from like rationalism to post-rationalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one question I want to ask you is like, what are the necessary moves you have to make to make that transition?
Okay. I should have caveated this with the meditation stuff in some sense too. I'll also caveat it with this, where although I love speaking about it abstractly, I'm wary of putting myself in any kind of guru position or something like that, because I do feel like I'm constantly learning new things in relationship to this kind of question. Definitely on the meditation front, but even on this rationalism, post-rationalism thing, which I think about a lot, where I'm like, oh, there was a way in which I was still confused about that. So caveat emptor. But you said, what is the necessary thing to make the rationalism to post-rat?
What are the steps required? What are the insights required to move from rationalism to post-rationalism?
Post-rat is kind of like a meme, or like it's kind of like a loose cluster emergent from Twitter of that is basically like, it's like people who have some amount of technical background who also think woo is cool. Like it's much looser. So post-rat is like less of a specific set of claims than, for example, like the David Chapman meta-rationality stuff that is like attempting to formalize a particular set of arguments. I'm not saying that like post-rat is bad, but so I could tell you what sorts of things are involved in David's arguments for how to get to meta-rationality, or we could talk about like what gives people post-rat intuitions, or like something like that, or like what causes that to show up as a social scene.
Let's do the former. I want to. What's the roadmap to get people from like Keegan stage 4 to 5?
Okay. So for people who don't have that meme in their heads, Robert Keegan, developmental psychologist, in the broadly like Piagetian lineage. So Jean Piaget sort of posited these stages of mostly cognitive development in infants that he sort of thought were universal, that have a certain structure to them. And then later people like Lawrence Kohlberg and others generalized that to other domains than just the cognitive. So Kohlberg was in moral development, but still in this sort of Piagetian tradition, often called constructive developmental. And David Chapman, I think, is probably mostly responsible for popularizing it within our scene, because he does two things. One is that he's in the Cells of the Eggplant book, I think it's now just called the Meta-Rationality book, is attempting to shepherd people across the transition from stage 4, in Keegan's terms, rationalism, to stage 5, meta-rationality. But also in his Meaningness book, in one portion of it, uses that to sort of give an account of the last few hundred years of human history, because there's an interesting way in which you can map the stages that an individual progresses through onto the stages that the culture has progressed through over time. So there are a whole bunch of arguments about like ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is sort of about like this developmental stages recapitulate evolutionary history to some extent, but you could also say, I think, more accurately in this case, that developmental stages recapitulate cultural history, because there's a structural relationship where you have to have understood one to get to the next one. Okay, let me give the version of the argument that exists in David's meta-rationality book. So the first thing he does is somewhat counterintuitive, which is he sort of assumes you're coming in as a kind of rationalist, but he has to refactor your understanding of what it is to be a rationalist. This is actually sort of what we were doing earlier in the conversation, in order for the shift to meta-rationality to make sense. So in some ways, you have to relativize your understanding of what you were doing with rationality and why it worked to a different understanding for the shift to meta-rationality to be possible. And one thing he calls this in the book is the ethnomethodological flip, which is a very unfelicitous name for it. Ethnomethodology is this tradition in sociology that involves very closely observing people to see what they actually do to resolve breakdowns in understanding and to resolve sort of meaning problems, instead of having an abstract theory about it. So like how do people enact social norms concretely in their behavior, instead of just imagining that they represent social norms abstractly in their heads, for example. The flip is this flip from considering, okay, so first he makes this distinction between what he calls everyday reasonableness and formal rationality, where everyday reasonableness is sort of this like, I'm going to the kitchen. Hey, why are you going to the kitchen? To go make some breakfast. Okay, so you just gave an account of your behavior there. You are accountable to me in some sense that when I ask you why you're doing that, you can give some, shallow justification for it. Shallow just in the sense of not being many step. But it's not like you wrote out the logic in a series of axioms on a whiteboard or whatever in order to derive the action that you're going to go make some breakfast, right? So there's everyday reasonableness has this shallow accountability to social justification, and it functions in a context-dependent way, but it's not derived from premises in a tower of justifications. Okay, the temptation from a certain view of rationalism, and you could see this in something like the heuristics and biases tradition that Daniel Kahneman popularized, or was responsible for, I should say, with Tversky in cognitive psychology. You can see it in a bunch of places, is to posit a paradigm of reason that is the formal thing, and then to notice all the ways in which what Chapman would call everyday reasonableness departs from those things, that standard, and consider those to be biases or defective approximations, or otherwise like attempts to get at the formal thing, but they just they don't have the compute, or they don't have the time, or like whatever. But it's all judged by reference to formal rationality. Okay, that's the stance that most people within the rationalist frame have about everyday reasonableness. The flip is to see it the other way, which is that formal rationality is a specialized application of everyday reasonableness, not the other way around. So when you see somebody make a sort of snap context-dependent judgment about something, they're not failing to be a perfectly rational utility maximizer. Rather, when they're being a perfectly rational utility maximizer, they're using the machinery that adapted to this, like in Heideggerian language, it's like coping, everyday coping, or like Hubert Dreyfus language, and doing a bunch of things to it that allow it to be more context and purpose independent. Does that make sense so far?
Rationality, Bayesian inference, axiomatizing.
Yeah, all of that depends on kind of like shielding of a closed world, which isn't actually your relationship to the world, and pretending that that's true, because you can pretend that it's true within certain kinds of domains, and then you get a bunch of power out of it. So that's the flip in the understanding of what rationality even is. That is the precondition for making the shift to meta-rationality.
Right. Rationality is a subset. It fits within. It is a hat you put on in certain contexts that works exceptionally well when you're trying to build a rocket to get to the moon. However, if you're trying to figure out, how to resolve an argument with your significant other, you probably don't want to be breaking out calculus.
Maybe not. Yeah, I would guess not. I would be impressed to see how somebody would even try to do that. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And go ahead.
No, I was gonna finish up.
So with that flip in understanding accomplished, that formal rationality ceases to be this context and this sort of perfect view from nowhere vantage point, then you can start to see how the relationship between your formalisms and the world are not themselves taken care of by the formalism. That there's some sort of reflective relating of the formalism to the world that rationality on its own doesn't have the tools for. For example, like even just like perception, like being in the world, bumping into it, is necessary for making sure that your formalisms about reality are maintaining a kind of contact with reality. This relates to the intentionality thing too, because when Smith says that logic lost its deferential relationship to the world, it's because it became formal symbol manipulation absent the sense of what those symbols were supposed
Syntax,
to be.
not semantics.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Meta-rationality is not just this reflective relating of your formalisms to the world, but taking multiple formalisms and knowing how to reflectively relate them to each other and to reasonableness, this lower thing, so to speak, such that you become a kind of wizard of rational systems of various kinds, and therefore have to be meta to them in the sense of not taking any one to be the perfectly from nowhere view of the world.
Yeah, the meta system isn't really a system itself. It's really just intuition at the end of the day.
Well, Chapman hates this word intuition.
He hates intuition.
Well, he hates the word intuition. He doesn't hate the phenomenon of intuition, specifically because a lot of sort of everything gets stuffed in the intuition bucket, and he wants to say we could be more precise about what's specific. Because like you're going to go to the psychic down the street, and the psychic's like, I have an intuition about you. They're not doing meta rationality. You know, like it is a concrete set of skills in a certain way, or like it depends on certain things. For example, you can't be meta rational without being able to be rational. This is one of the critiques you can make of post-rap scene. Is a lot of people just skipping.
they skip actually getting good at something.
Right. Or at least getting good at formal rationality. This is true of me to some extent. Like I'm not like a super technical person. But yeah, so intuition is fine except for that it covers a wide range of things, and there are more specific things being claimed about what you're doing with rationality. It's just you're doing something other than mere calculative formalism.
Yeah, that tracks complete. I do want to tie this back to the film. Okay. In the context of the film, Jordan Peterson comes up a couple times, and he talks a lot about these different archetypes. The Great Mother, the Great Father, order and chaos.
Yeah.
There's also a Buddhist undertone, and we talked earlier about a potential tension between symbolic and narrative thinking versus like direct experience, which seems to kind of be underneath all of that. And so my question is, how do you make sense of these bigger or more abstract phenomenon that Peterson's pointing at in the context of the free energy principle and predictive processing and all these things? What is he pointing at with order and chaos and the archetypes of the Great Mother and the Great Father? What is he talking about?
Okay. So there's how I use them in the film, and then there's like what he's up to, or like understands he's up to himself. In Maps of Meaning, within a sort of broader like Jungian lineage, I would say like most influenced by Jung, he's trying to give a grammar for the interpretation of what wisdom about how to act was contained in religious mythology. He has this view that basically like we lost that wisdom, and then that produced the nihilistic kind of crises of the 20th century to some extent. I'm vastly abbreviating the story, but that's the idea. So he's trying, but the myths themselves aren't very easy to interpret to modern ears, and so he's trying to give you a way of understanding them. And this Great Father, Great Mother, Divine Son thing is almost like more abstract even than archetypes in a certain sense. I mean, it is archetypal, but it's that narrow an account of it doesn't show up in any one tradition, but seeing how he unpacks that makes a bunch of different traditions intelligible. So, for example, in Mesopotamian mythology, you have Tiamat, who's this sort of like water chaos goddess that you slay to make the world. And that's the instantiation of this Great Mother archetype in that particular case, right? And then there's also Marduk, who's the equivalent of the sort of divine son in that context, like the individual that encounters chaotic potential and makes it orderly, makes the order that makes the world. Okay, So it's a kind of grammar for the interpretation of myth that makes it intelligible to modern ears in a certain way. Great Mother is associated with the unknown, unexplored territory, chaos, nature. These are like a set of associations. Great Father associated with the known, explored territory, culture, and the Divine Son, so-called, is the like mediator between those two things. That also has a positive and negative. So each of those has a positive and negative variant. So the Great Father can be tyrannical, but it can also be protective in the way that culture can be both tyrannical and protective. The Great Mother can be devouring, sense of like destructive, or it can be creative and generative, and it's sort of both. And then the Divine Son is the sort of individual mediator, which can be like the hero or the like satanic figure. It's also got this sort of bivalent character. And his meta-mythological kind of ethic that he lands on in the book is that you want to neither pathologically identify with the Great Father nor with the Great Mother in embodying the hero who sits on the border between order and chaos and continually renews the culture by dynamic confrontation with potential. Okay, that's the idea. That turns out to be a very easy mythological language to graft onto this predictive processing story of you have top-down priors, you have bottom-up sensory data. Bottom-up sensory data is in some way how the world gets in to your experience. You can't just get the bottom-up sensory data on its own, overwhelm you, you die, or just like it's underdetermined also. But nor can you have rigid trapped priors that try to shield the world out. Your life necessarily exists in a kind of literal sense. I'm going to talk about in the film how this is almost like constitutive of life in this dance between these two things. And then what sort of ethic emerges from that. In the film, tell me if am I answering your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the film, I take the sort of mythological motif of death and rebirth experiences that are often mapped onto psychedelic states, but also various rites and rituals. I mean, in the film, I talk about the mysteries of Eleusis, which, like every story ever, basically have the structure of being a descent into chaos and then a reemergence, ideally with more robust, more complex order, right? And the purpose of the emergence of chaos is to emerge with a sort of redeemed order in some way. And I talk about how, in the best case, psychedelic trips can be like that, where you have this descent into chaos and then you emerge with some less neurotic, more functional, more complex, more integrated ego. The limit case of that Peterson will discuss is that although you might undergo such a death and rebirth multiple times, and in each case of reemerging with a particular ego, and not necessarily in a psychedelic trip, just imagine like the micro insults of encounter with anomaly that you happen all the time. That can happen at different scales. The temptation is always to say, now I've figured it out. Now I am the understanding that will last forever and that is like permanently enduring. And that doesn't work because you're a finite thing in relationship to the infinite. And you will never arrive at an understanding that accomplishes that in a final way. Okay. So if, say you've got some order here and some order here, and you have a descent into chaos that gets you to this higher order, if this already collapsed, right, led to your descent into chaos, this can collapse too, no matter how high up the chain you get. Then what's the ethic that you should try to embody? And Peterson would say, it's the ongoing willingness to die and be reborn in the service of more and more good and habitable order and so forth. Right? So it's this kind of posture of voluntary self-sacrifice, voluntary confrontation with the unknown, not merely like letting yourself be devoured by the Great Mother, but like voluntarily encountering potential, allowing yourself to be kind of micro unmade or macro unmade to whatever extent is necessary in relationship to it, so as to continually revivify the order of your culture and of your own mind. Okay. To go back all the way to your question about like what does all this have to do with meditation? I think there's a non-arbitrary similarity between that and the Buddhist injunction to get off the wheel of death and rebirth. Because Buddhists will notice that you have these, in their cosmology, there's sort of the karmic experience of continually dying and being reborn, and maybe you have a better rebirth sometime, you have a worse rebirth another time. But at the end of the day, to the extent that you have not awakened, you're bound to the wheel and therefore hostage to the cycle of samsara that could lead you to be in a worse or better rebirth or whatever, but it doesn't really matter. It's sort of cyclical in their picture. There's not so much of a like historical progress narrative. An awakening consists in realizing that the non-dual awareness is neither born nor does it die. So never comes into inherent or independent existence, therefore never takes on this limited finite identity, therefore is not bound to the wheel of samsara. And I think in many ways, the phenomenology of that is parallel to this posture of voluntary self-sacrifice that Peterson talks about. Does that make sense?
So I want to talk about self-sacrifice. I want to draw a thread between self-sacrifice, identity, and then like scale-free hierarchies. Okay, scale-free hierarchies. There seems to be like a fractal organizational structure within the mind, but it goes all the way down to perhaps submodules within the minds, and even above if you want to get kind of woo with like superorganisms and cultures that we form a part of, right? How does birth and death and rebirth and all that? How's that consistent with this idea that we form these agents that are in this nested structure? How is it a stable structure if each link in this chain link fence is constantly being disintegrated and reborn? How do you have any sort of stability in that context?
Okay, so to step back a little bit to like, in what way do I use the scale-free hierarchy idea in the film? And then I think I'll get to your question. So Robin Carhart-Harris, who's like sort of the foremost psychedelic neuroscientist, certainly one of the most foremost psychedelic neuroscientists, whom I interview in the film, has this thing called the entropic brain hypothesis, which essentially consists in the observation that if you measure the entropy or unpredictability of neural signals, it will correlate to the richness of content of conscious experience when you ask people what their experience is like. And this is based in part on the observation that if somebody takes psychedelics and you measure what their brain is like, it becomes more entropic, more unpredictable neural signals, and they will say, "Holy shit, my experience is totally crazy." Right? So like not that wild an idea that like these two things would go together in some way. There's this idea of criticality. Criticality is an idea that comes out of physics and complexity science and other places, and it's about this condition that systems of all sorts will transiently inhabit when they're undergoing like a kind of phase transition. So an analogy that's often given is, imagine you're dropping single grains of sand into a sand pile, and it builds and builds and builds, and for the longest time the sand pile is sort of getting just getting taller. And at a certain point, the sort of top heaviness of it will cause it to have an avalanche, a kind of cascade, and the sand pile will change its form, but it's still kind of a sand pile, right? So it's, you could say, in the relevant language here, it's sensitive to perturbations, the grains of sand that you're dropping, while also being maintaining its form. And criticality is this sort of optimal balance between being sensitive to perturbations from the outside and maintaining your form, such that you can imagine two extremes of you perturb something and it just ceases to be what it is, or you're rigid and you're not getting any feedback from the world. It's thought that a lot of living systems inhabit something like this critical point for reasons we've been discussing, which is they need to model their environments, they need to be in dynamic interchange with their environments, but they can't simply enter into thermodynamic equilibrium with their environments where they just become soup, right? So there's this dance that they have to do of harvesting or taking in some of the entropy from the world, assimilating it into a model, and then continuing to interact with the world without losing, in a relative sense, their form. Criticality is considered sort of optimal for information processing. And one of the reasons why is that when brains get closer to the critical point, they exhibit scale-free hierarchies or fractal hierarchies. So scale-free just means the same sort of pattern or the same rule of organization appears at multiple different scales. And these are very good for information passing. If you think about a sort of like the typical fractal image of this or something like that, if you want information from down here to be able to reach up here, then what you want is for like, if it can get resolved down here, it should. But there's a way that it could continually get passed up the chain if it needed to make it to the topmost thing. So like, it would be bad if every micro perturbation could disrupt your deepest model.
Right.
But it would be bad also if there was no way for things to get beyond a certain level. So you see what I mean? Like there's this sort of like
it's like an opponent processing.
There's like an information processing advantage where you want to resolve things at the lowest level that you can, but you want it to be possible to resolve at the highest level you need to if that's necessary. Otherwise, you become out of touch with the world in some way. So there's a deep relationship between this like efficiency of information processing thing and this structure of scale-free hierarchy. And it emerges at the critical point. Robin argues, Robin Carhart Harris, that the ordinary waking consciousness of modern humans is slightly subcritical, and that psychedelic states bring you closer to criticality, which is like awfully close to this like being on the border between order and chaos thing, in a metaphorical way that Peterson is talking about. That's part of the way I use it in the film. But another way I use it, specifically related to this fractal idea, is that another of Robin's papers about the function of psychedelics is called Rebus and the Anarchic Brain, anarchic like anarchy, because they have the effect of collapsing these sort of hierarchies. So if the overly subcritical ego is like information from the world can't reach your deepest models and you're sort of cut off, then the psychedelic condition is everything is connected to everything else, and it's sort of structuralist and anarchic, but at least there's communication happening. It's like a flood. The walls are being broken down, but it's also not very structured in a functional way. And that's true in the mind, and it's true of the culture in which, for example, in the 1960s, psychedelics came into vogue, that it had this effect on the culture. So there's this analogy between internal psychological hierarchy and political hierarchy, where you can literally see, you have a bunch of people in a kind of rigid 1950s culture, psychedelics, and then the political consequences unfold.
Plato was right.
Well, okay, so tell me why you think that.
One of the things that's interesting about Plato is it's very hermetic in this, like, as above, so below, as within, so without. He I'm not a Plato scholar, so I'm sure someone's going to get mad watching this, but he basically tries to argue for what justice is he starts within the soul, and he talks about the state, and he finds some sort of a correspondence between like a well-structured soul and a well-structured society. Yeah. And so it's like there is this like fractal correspondence between how the brain is structured and how the external world is structured.
I think that's totally right.
No.
I think no notes. The one interesting thing, just to relate it to this death and rebirth thing that we're talking about, there's a great diagram in Maps of Meaning that I sort of had in mind when structuring the film, which is that the sort of individual heroic explorer may undergo this descent into chaos, and then they bring the boon, in like hero's journey language, back to the culture, but then they're not always received well by the culture because they're contaminated by this confrontation with the unknown. And so the presence of such a person might precipitate a descent into chaos on the part of the culture, from which it has to then emerge.
Oh, wow.
So there's this sort of like role by which individuals renew the culture, but there might be an intermediate step of the culture itself becoming chaotic. And like you have a figure like a Timothy Leary, who I don't think like was as responsible a hero, you could say, as he might have been. But like the FBI, like he got arrested. Like he was a vastly destabilizing force on the culture that he inhabited, partly because he had this encounter in his own mind. And this is the kind of thing that's going on in the Christ story, for example. It's like how does a culture treat a figure who's bringing this kind of not necessarily well, right? But it might take a long time for them to assimilate the insight that the hero contaminated by conflict with the unknown or contact with the unknown brings.
Jake, where can we find the movie?
It'll be out on April 20th. You can follow me on Twitter or go to my YouTube channel, Frame Problems, or to Waking Up's YouTube channel. It'll be in all those places. And Waking Up will send stuff out about it, but you can find it online in 8 days.
Awesome. I'll throw the links all in the description. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.